The African bush goes silent when death is coming. Not the peaceful quiet of midday heat. This is different. This is the silence of predators calculating, of prey sensing danger, of nature holding its breath before violence explodes across the savannah. And on this particular evening, as the sun painted the acacia trees in shades of amber and crimson, that silence was broken by a sound no father should ever hear, a cub's cry, not the playful yelp of a young lion wrestling with siblings, not the curious chirp of a cub discovering something new. This was a scream of pure agony, the kind of sound that cuts through every instinct a parent possesses and transforms them into something primal, something unstoppable. The cry came from the dry riverbed where the pride had been resting. Juma, a 5-year-old male lion with a mane like burnt copper and scars that told stories of 100 fights, was lounging with his pride near a rocky outcrop when he heard it. His head snapped up so fast his mane rippled like water. His amber eyes, which had been half closed against the fading heat, suddenly locked with laser focus on the direction of that sound. It was his son, Kumi, a 2-year-old male cub who had just started accompanying his father on territory patrols, learning the skills that would someday make him a king. The other lions froze too. The lionesses stopped grooming. The younger cubs halted their wrestling. Even the ancient baboon in the nearby tree shifted its weight, understanding instinctively that something catastrophic was unfolding. Juma was already moving before his brain fully processed what was happening. His massive frame, over 400 pounds of muscle and fury, rose from the ground with startling speed for an animal so large. He did not run toward the sound. He exploded toward it, his paws hitting the earth with such force that dust clouds rose in his wake. What waited for him in that dry riverbed would test everything he had learned in 5 years of ruling the savannah, everything that made him a lion, everything that made him a father. The story of how we got to this moment, to this 8-minute window that would become legend across the Mara, begins earlier that day. The morning had started like any other during the dry season. The rains had not come for 3 months, and the land was suffering. The grass had turned from green to gold, to a brittle brown that crackled beneath every poor step. Water sources were disappearing. Animals that had once roamed freely were clustering around the few remaining pools and streams, creating dangerous concentrations of prey and predator in shrinking territories. Juma's pride had been fortunate. They controlled a territory with a permanent river. Even during the driest months, the water source meant they could afford to be selective about their hunts. They did not need to chase every zebra or wildebeest that crossed their path. They could wait for the perfect opportunity, the weak or young animal that provided maximum nutrition with minimum effort. This luxury of choice had made them lazy in some ways, but it had also kept them healthy. Their ribs did not show. Their coats were full and dark. Their eyes were bright with the confidence that comes from knowing your next meal is guaranteed. Juma had sired 6 cubs with his 3 lionesses over the past year. Most were still dependent on their mothers, barely old enough to lap meat from fresh kills. But Kumi was different. Kumi was large for his age, already showing the physical markers that suggested he might grow into something impressive. The young cub had dark fur around his neck, the earliest signs of a mane beginning to form, and he had inherited something from his father that could be seen in the way he moved, a kind of fearless confidence that made even the adult lions take notice when he walked among them. That morning, Juma had decided to bring Kumi on a territory patrol. Nothing dangerous, just a walk around the borders, marking trees with his scent, checking for signs of invading males, the routine work that kept a territory secure. It was meant to be educational for the young cub, a chance to learn what it meant to be a lion, to understand that territory was not just something you defended. It was something you maintained constantly, vigilantly, obsessively. The patrol had taken them to the dry riverbed, a winding canyon of red earth and smooth rocks carved by water that had not flowed in months. The riverbed was useful during the dry season because it collected rainwater when storms passed, creating small pools that attracted animals desperate for hydration. Juma and Kumi had checked 2 of these pools and found them dry. They were moving toward a third, deeper pool that Juma knew from experience usually retained water even during the harshest droughts. When something shifted in the air, Juma smelled it first, a smell like nothing else in the savannah. Acrid, sharp, chemical almost, wrong, but he recognized it immediately because he had encountered it before, years ago when he was younger and less experienced. Porcupines, and not just one, multiple porcupines, which meant something had disturbed them. The smell of musk that they released when threatened hung in the air like a warning no sane animal would ignore. Juma should have turned back, should have grabbed Kumi by the scruff and led him away from the riverbed immediately. His instincts were screaming this. The older, wiser part of his brain that had kept him alive through 5 years of territorial battles understood that porcupines were not prey. They were danger with quills, hundreds of quills that could pierce flesh and work deeper with every movement, potentially causing infections that killed slowly and painfully. But Kumi did not have years of experience. He did not have the instinct that screamed danger. He had only curiosity and teenage recklessness. He had seen movement among the rocks, heard the strange huffing and clicking sounds that porcupines make, and his young brain had interpreted this as something to investigate, something possibly to hunt. Before Juma could react, Kumi had bounded ahead, his small frame darting between boulders with the confident stupidity of a cub who had never faced real danger. The porcupines had been hiding in a crevice near the deeper pool, a family of 5, 2 adults and 3 younger quill pigs, probably from the same litter. They had been resting in the relative coolness of the rocks when the shadow of movement had fallen across their shelter. Predator, the mother porcupine, a creature about 1/5 the size of Kumi but armored like a medieval warrior, had done what porcupines always do. She raised her quills and prepared to fight. Kumi's first attack was innocent enough, a pounce, quick and playful almost, the way he would attack one of his siblings during wrestling sessions. But this was not his brother. This was a creature that turned with startling speed and presented a back covered in thousands of needle-sharp quills, each one capable of drawing blood. The impact was catastrophic. Kumi's chest and front paws collided with the defensive porcupine. The quills penetrated his skin, his paws, his face. They were not fixed in place like spines on a cactus. They were loosely attached, designed to detach on impact and stick to any animal foolish enough to attack. As Kumi jerked backward trying to escape, dozens of quills came with him, embedded in his flesh, causing him to scream that awful scream that no father wants to hear. But it got worse. The commotion had alarmed the other porcupines. The father porcupine, larger and angrier than his mate, emerged from the crevice and attacked the already wounded cub. Then the younger porcupines, sensing their family was under threat, joined in the defense. 5 porcupines against 1 young lion, and the lion was already bleeding and panicking, thrashing around in the rocks, trying to escape the creatures that kept turning their backs and launching quills with every movement. This was the moment Juma arrived. This was what the father lion saw when he came around the bend in that dry riverbed, moving faster than anything so large had any right to move. His son, covered in dozens of quills, blood streaming from his face and paws, surrounded by 5 porcupines that were actively defending themselves against his increasingly desperate attempts to escape. And the roar that Juma released in that moment was not a roar of rage. It was something deeper, something older. It was the sound of every father throughout history facing a threat to his offspring. The moment froze. Juma stood at the entrance of the crevice, assessing the situation with the calm clarity that sometimes comes in moments of maximum danger. 5 porcupines. His son, wounded and panicking, quills that could kill him if they worked deep enough to hit vital organs or cause infections, and only 8 minutes of daylight left before the sun dropped below the horizon and the riverbed would become impossible to navigate safely. Juma had no time for caution. He had no time for the techniques that normally kept lions alive. Attacking porcupines directly was suicide for most animals. The quills were designed to protect against this exact situation, but Juma was not most animals. He was a 5-year-old male in his physical prime, with muscles built from years of hunting and fighting. More importantly, he was a father, and what happened in the next 8 minutes would become a story told by guides to tourists, by researchers to colleagues, by lions to each other in the silent language of roars and scent markings. Juma launched himself at the nearest porcupine with controlled fury, not recklessness like Kumi had shown, but calculated violence. He did not attack the rear where the quills were most concentrated. Instead, he went for the side, his massive paws pinning the smaller animal against the rock face. The porcupine squealed and thrashed, trying to turn its back toward him, but Juma was faster. His jaws closed around the creature's neck, not the killing bite he would use on prey, but hard enough to immobilize it. The animal went limp in his grip, and Juma released it immediately, already moving toward the next threat. 60 seconds elapsed. The father porcupine charged at Juma, his quills raised in a full-body defense posture. Juma sidestepped with surprising agility, letting the porcupine rush past him. As the creature turned to attack again, Juma struck from the side, using his shoulder to slam the animal into the rocky ground. The porcupine's breath exploded out of its lungs. For a moment it lay stunned. Juma did not wait for it to recover. He struck again, this time with his front paws, using his claws to rake across the porcupine's exposed side, away from the quill concentration. The animal screamed, a high-pitched squealing sound that echoed off the rocks. 2 minutes had passed. The 3 younger porcupines attacked together, moving with surprising coordination for creatures so young and inexperienced. They surrounded Juma, trying to present their backs to him from multiple angles, hoping to trap him between walls of quills. This was a tactic that would work perfectly against a panicked animal, but Juma was not panicked. He was operating on pure instinct and paternal fury. He twisted his body with impossible flexibility for something so large, dodging the quills, and struck the nearest young porcupine with a swipe that sent it tumbling across the rocky ground. 3.5 minutes. Kumi, still screaming and thrashing with quills embedded across his body, was backing away from his attackers. He was getting closer to the back wall of the crevice, which meant fewer escape routes. Juma understood the geometry of the situation immediately. He needed to clear the space, drive the porcupines away from his son, create distance and opportunity for the cub to escape toward the riverbed opening. The next porcupine that turned to present its quilled back toward Kumi received a lightning-fast paw strike from Juma that caught it off guard. The animal spun toward the new threat, away from the cub. This gave Kumi just enough space to scramble forward, toward his father and toward the opening behind Juma that led to freedom. 5 minutes. But one of the younger porcupines had adapted to Juma's tactics. Instead of turning to present its back, it tried a different approach. It lunged forward, attempting to strike at Juma's face with its quilled body. Juma twisted, but not fast enough. 3 quills penetrated his left shoulder, and he felt the sharp burn that meant they had pierced deep. The pain was immediate and intense, but he ignored it the way animals built for survival. Learn to ignore pain when something more important is at stake. Juma responded by charging the porcupine that had struck him, not giving it time to turn and fire quills again. He grabbed it in his jaws, shook it with controlled violence, and released it in the direction of the crevice's far wall. The animal struck the rock hard enough that Juma heard something crack, though he was not sure if it was bone or stone. 6 minutes and 30 seconds. The father porcupine, recovered from his earlier impact, was advancing on Kumi again, trying to finish what he had started. Juma did something that showed the kind of tactical thinking usually attributed only to primates. He placed himself between the porcupine and his son, but instead of attacking, he stood his ground. He let the porcupine approach, let it get close enough to see the detail of his face, let it understand that there was a much larger, more dangerous predator now occupying the territory it had been defending. The porcupine hesitated. That moment of hesitation was all Juma needed. He roared, a sound so loud and so full of primal fury that it seemed impossible something could produce it from within a body. The roar echoed off the rocks of the crevice, amplified and distorted until it sounded like multiple lions, an entire pride announcing their presence and their danger. The porcupines, creatures built by evolution to defend against predators but not to understand hierarchies or surrender, suddenly recognized something their instincts could process. This creature was more dangerous than they were. This creature was the apex. 7 minutes and 45 seconds. Juma charged forward, and this time the remaining porcupines broke. They scattered in different directions, some heading toward the crevice's depths, others toward the sides. The father porcupine, recognizing that his family's defensive position had been compromised, turned and followed his offspring toward the deeper rocks, where no lion would follow. Survival instinct had finally overridden territorial defense. 8 minutes exactly. Juma stood in the center of the crevice, breathing hard, his body covered in puncture wounds where quills had penetrated his thick hide. His left shoulder was particularly bad, the 3 quills still embedded deep, but his eyes were locked on Kumi. The cub came toward him, still whimpering, his entire front end a pincushion of quills. The young lion's left eye was nearly swollen shut. His chest and paws were bleeding from dozens of punctures. He looked like he had been attacked by a creature made entirely of needles, which in a way he had been. Juma did not comfort his son with gentle grooming or soft sounds. There was no time for that. The sun was dropping below the horizon, and in minutes the savannah would transform from a dangerous place into something far worse. The riverbed would become a hunting ground for nocturnal predators. Hyenas would emerge, leopards might move through the shadows. Any creature that found a wounded young lion separated from the pride would view it as an opportunity. Instead, Juma turned and began moving toward the crevice opening. Kumi followed, limping badly, still whimpering. The journey back across the dry riverbed should have taken 5 minutes. It took 15 because Kumi's wounds made walking difficult, and his panic made his movements erratic. But Juma did not leave his side. He did not rush. He moved at a pace his son could match, always keeping himself between the cub and any potential threat from the shadows that were lengthening as darkness approached. When they emerged from the riverbed, and the pride came into view, the lionesses reacted with visible alarm. They had heard the roar. They had recognized it as Juma's voice. But something in the sound had been wrong, had been desperate in a way that spoke of danger, even to their animal ears. Now they saw the reason. Kumi, covered in quills and bleeding, supported by his father, who was also punctured and bleeding from multiple wounds. The oldest lioness, Juma's primary mate, immediately moved toward them. She began examining Kumi's wounds with her tongue, her movements gentle but purposeful. She was assessing damage the way a mother assesses her child after injury, looking not just at obvious wounds but at the deeper damage that might not be visible. The quills themselves would need to be removed, and that process would be painful for the young lion. Some of the quills, the ones that had penetrated deeply, might cause infection if not properly extracted, but there was nothing to be done about that in the darkness. Juma settled himself near his son, his own body a barrier between the cub and the night that was now fully upon them. The pride formed a protective circle, the usual sleeping formation becoming more defensive, more alert. This was a night when everyone would sleep lightly, when every sound would be examined, when the normal routines of pride life would be suspended in favor of vigilance. In the days that followed, the true damage from the encounter began to reveal itself. Kumi's wounds, while numerous, were mostly superficial. The quills that had penetrated deeply were few enough that the cub's body could handle them. The infection Juma had feared did not materialize, though the young lion remained sore and limping for more than a week. What took longer to heal was the psychological damage. Kumi had learned that the world contained things that could hurt him. That confidence, that juvenile fearlessness, had been punctured as thoroughly as his flesh. For Juma, the aftermath was more complicated. The 3 quills that had embedded deep in his shoulder became infected despite his thick hide and the pride's attempts to help him clean the wounds. For 3 days, fever racked his body. He could barely eat. He moved stiffly, reluctant to use his left front leg. The lionesses had to bring him food, had to position themselves around him at night to maintain the pride's protection while he was vulnerable. But on the 4th day, something shifted. The fever broke. Juma rose to his feet with new caution, but with determination. The infection was receding. His body, built through 5 years of survival and adaptation, had the strength to overcome this assault. By the 5th day, he was hunting again, though with obvious pain. By the 2nd week, the infection was completely gone, and only the scar tissue remained as evidence of how close he had come to a different outcome. The story of what happened in that dry riverbed spread through the savannah the way lion stories do, not through words but through roars and presence, and the subtle alterations in how other lions regarded Juma. When neighboring males tested his territory borders in the weeks that followed, they sensed something different in him, something darker, something that suggested he would do anything to protect what was his. 3 different coalitions tested him in the following month. 3 different coalitions retreated with injuries, having learned the lesson that Juma was not a male to be intimidated. Kumi never quite returned to his previous fearlessness, but he gained something else in exchange. Wisdom, the kind of hard-won understanding that comes from nearly dying and being saved by love. He became more cautious in his hunting. He developed a respect for the things that could kill him that most young lions do not develop until much later, if at all. And he became in his own way a better lion because of it. The most remarkable aspect of the story, the part that lingers in the minds of the guides who tell it and the researchers who study it, is the precision with which Juma fought. 8 minutes, not a frantic scramble, but a calculated response. Not reckless attack, but tactical decision-making. He had fought the porcupines in a way designed to minimize the damage to himself while maximizing their desire to flee. He had not been driven by rage despite the obviously furious roar. He had been driven by intelligence and purpose and the kind of love that only a parent with an offspring in mortal danger can feel. 3 months after the dry riverbed incident, Kumi was fully healed. The scars on his face had faded to pale lines that would probably remain for life, visible reminders of the lesson learned in that rocky crevice. He was hunting regularly now, accompanying his father on territory patrols again, but with a different attitude. He was no longer a cub exploring with thoughtless curiosity. He was becoming a young male, aware of danger, respectful of it, but not paralyzed by it. Juma's shoulder healed completely, though if you knew where to look, you could see the scar tissue that marked where the quills had penetrated. He carried that reminder with him for the rest of his life, and in many ways, it became a badge of honor. Other lions could look at that scar and understand something about his nature. They could understand that he was the kind of male who would face death itself if it meant protecting his offspring. The porcupine family in the dry riverbed crevice also recovered, though the father porcupine never quite regained his previous confidence. He had learned something that few creatures of his species ever learn. He had learned that there were predators against which even the perfect defensive adaptation was not sufficient. When other porcupines in the region encountered evidence of lions moving through their territory, they would retreat to deeper cover, avoiding confrontation. The mara had enough danger without seeking out additional challenges. Researchers who studied the pride for years afterward made notes in their journals about Juma's behavior with his offspring. Unlike many male lions, who kill or ignore cubs that are not their own genetic offspring, Juma treated all the cubs in his pride with the same level of protection. He would position himself between them and danger. He would break up fights between juveniles that were getting too intense. And when the time came to drive Kumi and his brothers out of the pride, as nature required, Juma did so without the usual cruelty. He simply made it clear that they needed to find their own territory, that they could not stay in his domain, but he did so in a way that gave them the best possible chance of survival. Kumi, when he reached his adult years, would become known as a lion who understood something that not all males comprehend. He understood that a territory was worth defending, that pride was worth fighting for, and that family was worth dying for. Those lessons, learned in a dry riverbed surrounded by porcupines and pain, would guide every decision he made for the rest of his life. The 8 minutes that Juma spent fighting porcupines became something larger than the event itself. It became evidence of something that humans often forget about animals. It became proof that lions are not mindless killers operating only on instinct. They are capable of tactical thinking. They are capable of love so powerful that it overrides every other consideration. They are capable of calculated violence in service of protection rather than hunger. And when tourists ask their safari guides what it means to be a father, what it means to be a protector, what it means to be willing to face danger for those you love, the guides often tell the story of Juma and the porcupines. They tell about the 8 minutes that proved a point more eloquently than any human could articulate it. They tell about a lion who had every reason to abandon his cub in that crevice, to save himself from injury, to let nature take its course. They tell about a lion who instead chose something harder. They tell about a lion who chose love. And in that story, humans recognize something of themselves, something primal and true, something that exists in the hearts of all creatures, across all species, across all the boundaries that evolution has drawn. A father's love is a force that transcends everything. It transcends fear. It transcends pain. It transcends the normal rules of survival that govern the natural world. 8 minutes, 1 father, 1 cub, 5 porcupines, and a reminder that in the savannah, just as in the human world, the strongest thing any creature can be is willing to bleed for something they love. Years passed and Juma grew old. His mane, once the color of burnt copper, turned gray at the edges. The scar on his shoulder never fully healed, remaining as a permanent reminder of that afternoon in the dry riverbed. Young lions in the region would sometimes come upon this scarred old male and recognize him from stories their mothers had told. They would give him wide berth, respecting the warrior he had been, understanding that the strength to do what he had done came from something deeper than muscle. Kumi, when he finally met other young males and formed his own coalition, would pass the lessons down. He would teach his brothers and eventually his own offspring about the importance of family, about the cost of protection, about the kind of courage that matters. And somewhere in those teachings would be the memory of his father, covered in quills and bleeding, standing between him and danger, refusing to let circumstances dictate the outcome. The porcupines in the dry riverbed crevice would eventually move on, as wild animals do. They would migrate to different areas, seeking new dens, new food sources. But the story of that evening would linger in the rocks themselves, embedded in the history of the place like the quills had been embedded in Juma's shoulder. Rangers would pass through and sometimes find the location where it happened, identifying it by scar marks on the rocks and old bloodstains that time and weather had nearly erased. And they would tell the story to new safari guides, who would add it to their repertoire, who would tell it to tourists for decades to come. In this way, the 8 minutes became eternal. The specific moment in time became a lesson that transcended that moment. The father and cub became archetypes, examples of something humans have always known but sometimes forget, that love is not a luxury in nature, it is a necessity. It is the force that drives survival. It is the thing that makes life worth living. And in the African savanna, where danger waits around every bend, where predators stalk constantly, where the weak do not last long, the story of Juma and Kumi became a reminder that strength is not measured only in how well you can kill. Strength is measured in how far you will go to protect what matters most. In 8 minutes, Juma proved that truth more eloquently than any number of successful hunts could have done. The sun sets over the Mara, each evening the way it always does, painting the sky in colors that seem impossible. And somewhere on that vast grassland, in territory that Juma once ruled, a lion might look at a scar on his body and remember the cost of protection. He might remember his father, bleeding and fierce, standing between him and something that wanted to kill him. And in that moment, before darkness falls and the hunt begins, he might release a roar that carries across the plains, a roar that says thank you, a roar that says I remember, a roar that says I understand now. And that roar will be heard by other lions, who will understand it the way animals understand things that do not need to be spoken. They will understand that this lion has learned something fundamental about what it means to be a father, about what it means to be a lion, about what it means to matter enough to someone that they will face 8 minutes of chaos and pain and fear for you. That is the legacy of those 8 minutes. That is the power of a father's love. That is the story of Juma and the porcupines that will be told as long as there are lions in the Mara, as long as there are guides to tell the stories, as long as there are humans willing to listen to the lessons that nature offers about the things that really matter.